Michael-John Bristow is a public speaker, author, and a cognitive neuroscientist. His science-based methods combine real research with clinical experience, and he has the utmost capability to explain the most complicated subjects in a very fun and engaging manner. I've included links to his classes down below, which you could check out. I believe his classes are really educational, fun, and the best thing is it's very interactive. Please do check it out and support his groups. Thank you. Right, okay. Hi everyone, I'm with Michael-John Bristow, who's a neuroscientist, author of 2 books, and the founder of Go Neuro. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you here. Maybe you could share a bit on what Go Neuro is about to begin.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Nicholas. Go Neuro is a corporate training company where I focus on soft skills, typically for large multinationals. So topics like communication skills, leadership development, presentation skills, and so on. My academic background is cognitive neuroscience. So I was a research neuroscientist for a while, and then discovered I liked teaching people about neuroscience more than I liked sticking electrodes into rat brains. And so that's what shifted me into the corporate training and public speaking realm. So here I am.
Very nice. I'll have all the links of where they could find you, and as well as the book that you've written in the description box below. I found those classes that you had on Eventbrite really intriguing, as I'm sure this interview would be. I was thinking how I could structure this whole questions would be around the neurology of development, which would come in sort of themes. Maybe we could start off with like prenatal conditions, then moving on to toddler stages, adolescence, and so on and so on. For my first question, in the womb, right? The baby's brain development is incredibly plastic and adaptable to change. This is why some mothers would play music for their unborn children to listen to as a means to stimulate their auditory senses and brain structures. I'm wondering, is there any truth to this, and what else could parents do to kind of like enhance their child development prenatally?
Yeah, prenatal neural development is a really interesting topic. A lot of researchers spend their entire lives just focusing on that. I wish there was truth to the idea of playing music for the baby in the womb. Unfortunately, it does nothing at all. What parents can do that does work is just the person carrying the baby make sure to get plenty of good food and don't do drugs. It's the classic message, but really that's it. As long as there's plenty of good food, so the fetus is getting the nourishment it needs, and there are no drugs to stunt development, things are going to go well. And of course, I suppose no physical damage. Punching the mother in the stomach is not going to be helping anyone.
Right. And coming into the territory of the environment of the womb itself, I stumbled across the maternal immune hypothesis, which is basically talking about fraternal birth orders and sexual orientation of how the children will turn out. What they found in the study was after hosting the first male fetus, the woman's hormones are greatly imbalanced and affected by the testosterone, and thus its body develops mechanisms where male antigens would arrive and protect the mother against future male embryos, which would then suppress the sex steroids in their brain, which would then lead to androphilia or an attraction to males. How credible is this theory?
Yeah, so that was a research paper that came out some years ago that really rocked the community in a lot of ways. It has since been supported by additional research. So it is quite credible. And what started it was researchers noticed that if a child is born, the more older brothers that child has, and the child is male, the more likely that child is to be gay themselves. And researchers have tried to figure out why that is the case. And the reasoning is, at the moment, an educated guess. The idea is male fetus causes more testosterone to be in the mother. The future children then have a different hormonal balance because of how the mom's body reacted to that additional testosterone in the first male. That is an educated guess. We don't actually know if that's the reason. What we do know for sure is that the more older male siblings you have and you're male, the more likely you are to be gay.
Right.
Yeah, and the data supports that regardless of culture, regardless of where you live in the world, etc. Oh. My own family is actually a good example of this. I'm one of 3 boys.
Okay.
And I am straight. My middle brother is bisexual, and my youngest brother is gay. Wow. We're almost an exact perfect scale.
Exhibit A. Oh. I would really be interested in if they could prove if the opposite was true as well. If, like, let's say the sort of birth order for females, if the third born daughter, for example, would be turning out to be lesbian, or but then again, I
now
would,
with women, with women we do not see the same thing.
Right.
And if we take the hypothesis with males and we carry it on, women are already used to having enormous amounts of estrogen in their body. And so having a female fetus, that's just a little more estrogen. It essentially makes no difference to the body. So there's nothing for the body to really respond to.
Right.
So no, if you are female and you have a bunch of older sisters, you are not more likely to be gay. I'm sorry, I lost you for a second there. Could you say that again?
Yeah. So I would pretty much say that if that's the case, then I guess the existence of lesbians would be a bit more unclear as to why, as if we would compare it to like males, for example.
The reason people are gay, male or female, is still not completely understood, but we have come a long way from even just say the 90s. As best we can tell, it's a hormonal thing. So fetal development, neurologically and physically, is influenced enormously by the kinds of hormones that fetus gets. To the point where, and no one can do this because it would be enormously unethical, but if I just pumped a fetus with the right sex hormones at the right time, that child's going to grow up and be gay.
Right.
It's not hard. And so 1,000 different things can impact the exact type and quantity of hormones that a fetus receives. Older siblings is one example we already used, but other things like air pollution, like whether the mother, what physical activity the mother was doing on a given day, what food the mother ate on a given day. It's so complex that we can't just say, hey, moms, do this, and this is going to lead to these specific results. And our best guess is it's a hormonal thing primarily, but we know genes play a component as well. We just don't know how.
Right. Okay. So after the child is born then, and especially in today's contemporary environment, how much should we be exposing the child to? Are there studies to show how kids will turn out after early exposure to social media, for example, pornography, violent movies? What is then the optimal exposure, and what are the gray areas?
That is a great and also a really hard question. The whole area is gray, to be honest. It doesn't look like media exposure actually causes as much harm as people think, if any. The challenge seems to be human interaction. So if a child is ignored by their parents and is watching TV 12 hours a day while they're awake, the problem is not that the child is watching 12 hours of TV. The problem is that the child is not interacting with other humans.
Right.
It's the human interaction that seems to matter. So if a kid is plopped in front of a TV for, say, 6 hours a day, but then they get 3 hours of really good human interaction, from what we can tell, being in front of the TV for 6 hours does nothing. Nothing that, as best we can tell. But if the media interaction is taking away from the human interaction, then we have concern.
I see. Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. I've also seen studies finding associations with IQ and exercise. Now, how much of a role does exercise play in brain development, and why?
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics. Oddly enough, the number one thing we can do to improve mental performance and to decrease mental decline as we age is not any brain activity, it's physical exercise. By far, the most effective thing we can do to improve the quality of our own brain. Now, we've known that's been the case for decades, but we didn't know why until very, very recently. And just recently, a great paper was published, and it does seem to be supported by additional research, suggesting that IQ is almost directly correlated with the amount of blood flow getting to your brain. And the number one way to increase blood flow to the brain is physical exercise. What it does is it actually increases the size and the length of the capillaries, the teeny tiny arteries and veins that embed your entire brain. The brain gets more blood. It's like giving more electricity to a computer processor. It just runs faster and better, which is fascinating. That to improve our brain, we don't actually do mental exercises, we do physical exercise. Now, the physical exercise we do does matter. It's aerobic exercise specifically that promotes capillary growth. So aerobic exercise is the type that gets our blood pumping really hard and makes us sweat. So running, bicycling, etc. Weightlifting is considered anaerobic exercise, meaning it doesn't make you breathe really hard and sweat really hard typically. It's the aerobic exercise that is best for mental health.
Okay. It's interesting that you say that physical activity has a superior effect over like any mental gymnastics you'll be able to do, like in terms of cognitive training and all that, because I see quite a lot of neuro-linguistic programming, visual kinesthetic and audio kind of programs that companies are selling. Like, for example, Brain Gym. I think there's one in the US called Brain Balance as well, where they claim to treat ADHD or autism and many developmental issues, and they have courses starting from like $5,000. Are there a lot of evidences supporting these kind of claims where by going through such a vigorous course on cognitive trainings and development would they actually lead to any sort of growth in terms of performance and abilities?
I wish that those kinds of trainings led to overall cognitive performance, because then it would be an incredible tool. Unfortunately, it's snake oil. It just doesn't. Now, this doesn't mean cognitive training is useless. Cognitive training will make you better at the one thing you're practicing. But increasing overall brain strength, physical exercise is what does that. So if I do a bunch of training exercises that are math problems, I will get better at those types of math problems, but it will not translate to me being better at other types of math problems, or me being better at writing or doing chemistry. It will only make me better at that one thing that I'm practicing.
I see. So it's basically like practicing for the IQ test, right? You may get better results on IQ test, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're more intelligent in that sense.
Boom. You got it exactly right.
Right. Okay. In my country, in Singapore, pragmatism and just being really competitive is really encouraged. So much so that by age 4, a lot of parents are really enrolling their children into private tuition to get ahead of the pack. So we produce exceptionally book smart kids. Like, I think we are number 1 in terms of maths and science, but is such early exposure to intensive studying a good idea?
As best we can tell, it depends on how intense you mean and what you want the child's goals to be once they grow up. Oh, in the US, a lot of times we talk about work-life balance, which in some places is almost seen as a silly notion. The idea is to be successful and to focus on that. And the US does a whole lot of that as well. But there are some interesting cultural differences here. The positive side of that kind of intensive training is it teaches the brain how to focus intensely and for long periods of time on something. And that is enormously valuable.
Yeah.
Brains are so easily distracted that teaching it to focus more effectively can allow someone to improve by leaps and bounds. And so I'd say, now there's value in all that the child is learning as well with that kind of intense schooling. I would say the greater value is it teaches them a lifelong, hopefully lifelong, ability to focus, to pay attention, and to knuckle down for long periods of time.
Okay. Because there are some concerns of how their social development would be in terms of holding conversations, in terms of antisocial behavior in public and stuff like that. But
yes, so I could use my own original field as an example. My original goal was to be a surgeon.
Yeah.
And surgeons are known, at least in the US, for being incredibly arrogant. And I wanted to go into neurosurgery. And neurosurgeons in particular are known for not just being arrogant, but for being downright psychopathic. As you spend that amount of time focusing on an extremely challenging technical skill, then to develop any skill requires time and requires focus. So if we spend all our time on one skill, then it might suggest that the social skills won't be as developed, unless the person is just innately a very social person. And a lot of people are that way. We all have our own genetic, innate, call them talents, if you will. Yeah, so one has to decide what kind of balance one wants. If one doesn't care about being very great socially, then by all means, pour all your energy into some kind of fantastic work, if that's where you're going to get the best results. And I think the challenge comes between parents and children, and what the child wants to do and what they think they want to do versus what the parent thinks will lead to the greatest success, and how to balance that between the parent and the child.
Right. Just balancing out the opportunity cost, I'm guessing. Okay.
Opportunity costs is a good way to phrase it. Yeah.
Let's say the children has developed into adolescence. I think China has recently banned video games for children under 18. It's a huge national thing going on there. I think they're only limited to about 3 hours max of video games a week. Is there any evidence behind such moves, and what are your thoughts on video games, and should children partake in much of them?
My particular field has an interesting perspective on this topic, because in surgery, the number one thing you can do to improve your surgical skills, besides actually performing more surgery, is playing video games. It improves your hand-eye coordination better than a musical instrument, better than a sport, better than anything.
Right.
Video games. And I was at a number of hours of video games per week in order to improve my own skills. Most people don't know that. And it's not often seen that way outside of the neuroscience world. So let's talk first about what tends to be the biggest concern with video games, which is violence. Yeah. There is no evidence that violent media of any kind actually increases violent behavior. I mean, TV shows, movies, and video games. What it does do, and this is newer research, is it does make the person more impatient while they are playing the game, which is why we unfortunately see YouTube videos of people playing a game and getting so upset with a bad performance that they throw their controller at the screen, or do things that you wouldn't expect people over the age of 3 to do. It looks ridiculous. So it does make someone, and actually it can be quite impatient while they're playing the game itself, but after the game, we see no long-term negative effects when it comes to anger or violence, etc. What we're not sure of yet is what it does to attention. If someone plays a lot of video games, is it harder for them to focus on a good book? Is it harder for them to focus on their studies? We don't actually know that yet. And that's a big question that remains in my mind.
Interesting. I think around the teenage years would be when kids or children would basically kind of know and learn about what their sexual orientation, and just to come back a bit onto that topic of how it develops and stuff. I guess there has been quite a lot of backlash recently, and I think a lot of organizations like the APA has came out to say that sexual reorientation training does not work, and it can be harmful, and thus it's not really carried out anymore. Like, for example, gay conversion therapy is banned now. Why is it not effective? And if so, would it logically follow that it would be meaningless if we were to retrain or rewire pedophiles, for example, who feel that their fetishes or attractions are not stemming from personal choice?
Oh, oh, you hit some good questions, Niklaus. Okay.
Yeah.
When we talk about sexuality, we have our sexual orientation. We also have our sexual identity, whether we feel male or female. Sexual identity is, as best we can tell for all intents and purposes, is set in the womb. If a brain happens to be in a male body, but it feels really female, the kid's going to know that. The moment they know what a boy and a girl are, they're going to feel that. Sexual orientation is something that we really start to feel and hits us in puberty, when suddenly we're hit with all those sex hormones and we start to get a feel for what we like and what we don't like in terms of what we're attracted to. That is when other sexual attractions can come in, whether it be something truly harmful like pedophilia, or whether it be other kinks that aren't harmful at all, as long as you're doing it with a consenting partner. Now that I've settled that, I forgot what your original question was. Could you give it to me again?
Yeah, sure. So why is sex conversion therapy, or it's not sex conversion therapy, but like gay conversion therapy or sexual reorientation training not effective?
Okay. There are two reasons it's not considered effective. One is your hormones are your hormones, and conversion therapy does not change one drop of the hormones that are coursing through your brain. And so it's not going to change the brain. The brain feels what it feels. Gay deconversion therapy is roughly similar to trying to give people therapy to convince them they have a tail.
Right.
It just ain't there. Now, here's the really tricky part. If you got 1,000 people and worked really hard in therapy to convince them they have a tail, you probably could convince a couple of them that they actually do have a tail, because the brain is plastic and it is malleable. But that would be considered abusive. No ethics committee in any country would allow that to happen, even rather unethical countries. And that is the second reason we consider gay conversion therapy deeply wrong. Because even if for some people it worked, it would be a profound manipulation of who that person is.
Yeah.
And I can't come up with any ethical reason why we would want to manipulate someone's brain that way. Now, if we want to go to a completely different topic, like someone who is attracted to children, well, we can't let them hurt children. At the same time, after having tried to change them through therapy, we've also learned that that really doesn't work either. And so that's a much harder topic, because there we have to do something to protect the innocent.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard question.
Coming on to like the later stages of human development, I have heard that trauma can be passed down into your offspring. For example, they ran a study on Holocaust survivors and their children and found a link in epigenetic inheritance, where they were having increased likelihood of stress disorders. Does trauma turn on or off something in the genes or the brain that can cause this effect?
Yeah, this is a genetics question. Some of my favorite classes, and you have to take so many genetics classes for neuroscience, and I love them. Right. It used to be thought that all the encoding was in the DNA directly. It's just in the genes. More recently, one of the most interesting fields in all of medicine has arisen called epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how the DNA is folded and read within the cell. And that does actually alter the way genes are expressed in the body and in the brain. So people who are born in poverty, who are malnourished, if they have children, their genes are actually going to be different. And their children's children are too. The DNA, the actual code doesn't change at all, but the way the DNA is wrapped in red does change, which changes the proteins and hormones that the body makes, which is going to change the development and behavior of the individual. And we know it doesn't just go from parents to children, it goes at least 3 generations, those epigenetic shifts.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'm just a bit mind blown. But speaking of turning on or off mechanisms in our brain, is the classifications of drugs in the US sort of like a pyramid chart showing how drugs dangerous could be? Meaning, does class A drugs necessitate more harm than class B and so on and so forth?
So in the US, the drugs are labeled based on legality, and they're labeled based on what's called a schedule. I have no idea why we call them schedule. It's Schedule 1 drugs are drugs that are considered only harmful with no possible research or medicinal value. Schedule 2 drugs are considered harmful, but there might be some medicinal or research value. And then it goes down the scale from there. And it is kind of like a pyramid. In neuroscience and psychology, we all have a huge bone to pick with the way drugs have been characterized and legalized in the United States, because it was done purely on the whim of law enforcement agencies in the United States. It was not done based on any research, based on any consulting with psychologists and neuroscientists. In fact, when the scheduling originally came out, essentially the entire body of psychologists in the United States sued, saying this is wrong and based on nothing. They sued the DEA and they won. Wow. The judge said, yeah, this scheduling is clearly based on nothing. You can't do it. But here was the problem. So the DEA removed the scheduling because the judge ruled it. But there was no ruling saying that the DEA couldn't just do it again later. So the DEA got rid of it, waited 6 months, put all the scheduling back in place, and no one could do anything about it.
Wow.
And because the United States is such a heavyweight on the global field, the United States could basically tell the rest of the world how they should schedule their drugs too. And so when this initially happened in the 70s, most countries just kind of went along with what the US said, which is unfortunate. And so drugs that cause essentially no harm, like most of the psychedelic drugs that have enormous medicinal benefit, that are supported by essentially every psychologist and neuroscientist on the planet, in the US are considered a Schedule 1 drug, the most harmful type, along with heroin, which is absurd, insane, and stupid. It was just an unfortunate quirk of history that drugs ended up being labeled the way they were in the US, and that the US had enough power to essentially push it on others.
Wow, it's really political.
Incredible. It was entirely political. Yep.
Yeah. Are there any sort of drugs or supplements that one could take to kind of mimic, I guess, the movie Limitless in a sense, or are we just not there yet and will never ever be?
Performance-enhancing drugs, that's what you're asking, yes? Yeah. The movie Limitless.
Limitless?
No, there's nothing like that. That being said, there might be. I don't see any reason in terms of the psychology and physiology of the brain to suggest that we couldn't one day figure that out. In fact, I think the odds are decent that we will.
Right.
Yeah. I think that will likely happen. Maybe not to limitless levels, but performance enhancing. And part of the reason I think that is we already do have performance enhancing drugs.
Okay.
Stimulants are performance enhancing. Caffeine improves memory and performance on a variety of cognitive tasks. Stronger drugs, like the amphetamine class of drugs that are often given to people with ADHD, are absolutely performance enhancing. Absolutely they are. Yep. Now, it's not by an enormous amount. You can't take performance-enhancing drug and have your test scores go from 50% to 95%. But you will see improvements. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Lastly, then on to like the latter stages of life. Is the saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Does that hold any water? And how does our brain react to learning, processing, and memory at an older age?
Here I have almost nothing but good news. We used to think that after your brain peaks, cognitive decline happens pretty quickly. That is not at all the case. In fact, as long as someone does a little bit of work, we see basically no cognitive decline. Your brain can be just about as good at 80 as it was at 35. So a quick bit of neural development for you, since that's the topic we've been on. When you're born, you have a billion neurons doing a billion crazy things. They're being born, they're dying, they're going all over the place. Yeah. As you grow, your neurological power essentially just goes up and up and up and up. And then your neural development, meaning the fundamental physiological foundations of the way your brain is wired, that only happens at 25. But it's only at 25 that your brain stops its childhood development. And that is also when you're at your neurological peak in terms of just raw processing power and mental performance. You stay at that peak for about 10 years. So from 25 to 35. Once you hit 35, that's when we do start seeing cognitive decline. Right. But as long as we work at it, that cognitive decline is actually incredibly small. It's far less than we used to think it was. This is assuming, of course, we're not talking about the dementias like Alzheimer's, which is just going to knock your brain into oblivion. But as long as your brain doesn't get dementia, what we want to do, physical exercise and social interaction. It's exercise and love. And that'll keep the brain good, basically, for your whole life.
That's very heartening to hear. Touching a bit on severe mental illnesses there. I've seen this 2014 meta-analysis that was its basic conclusion was that parents with severe mental illness has quite a high likelihood in sort of having children with the same. I think they found that a third of their offsprings actually develop severe mental illnesses prior to adulthood. Is it just based on pure genetics, or is there other factors that could be at play here? For example, if you're living with a parent who has a severe mental illness like Alzheimer's or schizophrenia, could then that, I guess, stress that you are growing up with in that environment kind of push you into having severe mental illnesses itself rather than the genes that you're born with?
Okay. That's a broad question. So let's break it down. It does depend on the type of mental illness we're talking about. Some seem to be almost entirely genetic, where environment doesn't matter at all. Just if your parents have it, you're going to have it. True of other diseases of the body too. Some seem to lean a little more environmental. So often when we talk in medicine, especially in psychology, we talk about nature versus nurture, as if there's some kind of battle going on. In psychology, there's no battle and hasn't been for decades. Everything is a combination of both. Yeah. Even something that we think must be entirely genetic, like eye color, believe it or not, environment can actually impact our eye color. Very basic things like that. Height is another good example, where of course our genes are going to play a role in our height, but the food we eat growing up is also going to play an enormous role in our height. The pollution we live in and breathe is going to play a role in our height. We can look at mental health disorders the same way. If you have two parents, that being said, things are more genetic than we typically like to think. Right. And they are often more genetic than environment in many cases. For example, if you have two parents who are schizophrenic, but you were raised perfectly in the most perfect, wonderful environment, your odds of getting schizophrenia are still enormously high. The environment's not going to make that much of a difference.
I see.
If you have two parents who are deeply depressed, the odds of you getting depression are very high. But if the environment is incredibly good, the severity of that depression might be less than it would have been otherwise. And if you have two parents who didn't suffer from depression at all, but they abuse and beat you growing up, they're probably going to have depression. Some kind of terrible trauma, be it PTSD, be it one of the anxiety disorders, et cetera, et cetera. So you can have essentially no genetic risk and still get a mental health disorder if you have a traumatic childhood.
Yeah.
Or heck, a traumatic adulthood. It can still happen in adulthood. It's just less likely.
Right.
That being said, if you have a perfect childhood and your genes are just bad, there are going to be some struggles. Yeah.
That's quite unfortunate. Well, I think just sort of like a bonus question then, and then something that I kind of want to talk a bit on as well. I think there's this famous psychologist, Jordan Peterson. He once said that women prefer people, men prefer things, hence that the disparity in career outcomes and choices. Now, I'm wondering, is there really such stark differences in female and male brains? And if not, what do you think of those comments?
Yeah, so you gave me a link to a short clip from Jordan Peterson, and I did watch that before this. One of my big areas of research when I was still a research neuroscientist was something called sexual dimorphism. Sexual di just means two, morph means shape. So dimorphism is the study of differences between males and females. Sexual dimorphism in the brain is something that I spent a good amount of time in my own research on. And in the brain, we have these things called SDNs, which stand for sexually dimorphic nuclei. They are parts of the brain that do seem to be consistently across large sample sizes different between male brains and female brains. Male and female brains are physiologically different. I can look at them with my eyes. I don't even need a microscope. And I can tell with pretty good accuracy whether the brain is male or female just by holding it in my hands and looking at it. Wow. They are different, but they are overwhelmingly more similar than different. And there was a point in the clip you sent me where Jordan Peterson does actually do a very good job specifying that, where he says, hey, women prefer people, men prefer things. That is a common refrain. And guess what? There is some truth to that. There is, but only across large sample sizes. And Jordan Peterson does say in that clip, now this doesn't relate to single individuals, and the differences are quite small, but they are there. And Jordan Peterson did do a good job of saying that. The challenge is that's not how most people seem to read his interviews.
Right.
Most people seem to read it as saying, oh my goodness, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Look how different the brains are. And he doesn't actually say that. And the brains are not that different. So a phrase that I like to use, the difference is statistical, not categorical. What I mean by that is you can say, okay, across large sample sizes, we do see this very small difference, but that doesn't mean we can use it to categorize people. So that doesn't mean we can take a random woman off the street and say, you would probably like being a nurse more than an engineer. The odds of us being right are pure 50-50. It's essentially pure chance. It's only when we look at thousands or even hundreds of thousands and millions of people that we see very small differences in the data. They are there, and we can't pretend they aren't. They are also quite small. And male and female brains are overwhelmingly more similar than they are different.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I guess my last question would be, have you seen any research on sort of the differences in neurodevelopment in polygamous cultures and cultures that practice monogamy? I believe for throughout the history of time, there has been more cultures that have been polygamous. I think 85% represent that sort of categories. Yeah, so I'm just wondering how would their neurological development be like in terms of juggling several families and in terms of love and stuff like that?
That is a great question. I do not know of one single research paper that actually addresses it.
Mm.
Now, that's off the top of my head. Doesn't mean a paper isn't there, but wow. Yeah, I don't know of a single paper that actually talks about that. That's a really interesting idea for future research, though. Yeah. If I was still in research, that's one I might pick up. That's a good one. I'm sorry, I don't know of any research that actually addresses that question.
Yeah, because I've just like recently came across certain discourses of how some people were kind of like playing out thought experiments of, if let's say the whole world became adopted polygamy, and how that would kind of turn out and stuff, and how our I guess like certain structures in regards to family and society would be like. So I thought maybe that would be a question that I would kind of like take to you, or like maybe think about myself. But yeah,
I can give you a little something there. So okay, so I can give you a tiny little something.
Mm.
Here's what research does seem to suggest. In polygamous cultures, where a minority of the men take a majority of the women, the result appears to consistently be increased violence.
Right.
Because there are more and more men who simply don't have the opportunity to have families, to have a partner. And males, we talk about differences between males and females. Male brains are absolutely more physically violent than female brains. They simply are. They simply are. Regardless of culture, regardless of upbringing or anything else. And if males want a family and a partner and can't, that is a recipe for violence.
Right. Yeah, and I guess
we actually have seen.
That makes a lot of sense, because I mean, if you look at the prisons, in basically any country, it's usually male dominated rather than the opposite way. But that kind of leads me on to another question, because I do see a bit of a problem of incels uprising as well. I'm not sure if you've heard of the term, but it's yeah. What do you feel about that? And is there any way we could kind of mitigate that when it comes to our society today? Because I don't really see there being any sort of solutions to that, other than them just seeking help and getting therapy on their own accord, actually.
And I'm inclined to say your instinct is correct. Therapy.
Right.
So that an individual, and this is true of whether you're male or female, an incel or whatever, the ability to see yourself as a productive creature of worth, regardless of the relationships in your life or what other people say or do to you, is perhaps the most important skill to have a happy life that I could possibly choose for us. It can be an enormously hard skill to develop, especially depending on the person's upbringing. And with a group like incels, it can be really easy to look at a group and just say, oh, well, they're stupid. They're acting like children. They need to just grow up and not be stupid. That, unfortunately, doesn't lead to the kind of understanding that might allow us to help those kinds of people. And I'm not immune to that. When I first started reading articles about incels, I thought, well, what horrible, terrible people. These are just terrible people.
Yeah.
I don't think we can paint a brush like that. And I've since tried in my own small way to develop understanding and compassion for incels specifically, but for other groups too. And I don't know how it is in Singapore. I'd actually be curious. That in the United States, healthcare is apocalyptically expensive. And it's not something that's just granted to people.
Yeah.
You either have to have a job that gives you health insurance, or you are simply screwed. You are simply screwed. And so, that's especially true of mental health, which is covered less often than physical health is by health insurance here in the United States. And so if I could have a say, I would require therapy for all humans.
Yeah.
For all humans, because even for those who are very mentally well, there's never a point where you can't be even more mentally well.
Mm.
And for people who are really struggling, like incels, who feel like they're just rejected and they're screwed, or they're not getting screwed, as in the case with incels, they need to have someone to talk to. They need to have a way to reframe things in a positive light so they don't have to feel terrible and rejected and alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. Yeah. It's quite a lot to think about there as well. Oh, wow. I guess coming off of such dark topics, maybe we'll kind of end it off on a bit of like a lighter tone. I see certain conditions where and maybe also some that you've seen for yourself or that you're specialized in terms of like ADHD, schizophrenia and stuff like that. The law has different sort of avenues for such individuals where if they are born with such conditions that they would have diminished responsibility because of how they are mentally and cognitively. I'm wondering if that also applies to how much they should be responsible in terms of sort of contributing towards society in a sense. Like would there also be an argument for people with these conditions not to be able to have certain roles in society, like as a manager or positions of power where they could actually influence quite a lot of things, and because of that of the condition that they're born with, could people then make the argument that, oh, if we're not going to charge them based off their condition in the eyes of the court, then should we really be giving them power in certain positions at work, stuff like that? What are your thoughts on this whole discourse about neuro law and responsibility and ethics and all that?
Yeah, in theory, it's very sound. In theory, it's incredibly sound. Of course, people are born with different brains. If someone's schizophrenic, we probably don't want them driving a car when they have a schizophrenic episode. That's just a recipe for doom and probably death. In actual practice, based on history, it appears that it might forever, in perpetuity into the future, be impossible to implement.
Right.
Because who gets to decide that, and who says it's fair?
Yeah.
And if someone is diagnosed with depression, but then 5 years later they're diagnosed with bipolar disorder, do their freedoms suddenly change because their diagnosis changed? Their brain didn't. Their brain is still the same brain, but our diagnostic tools are far from perfect.
Yeah.
And even if our diagnostic tools were perfect, depression is a massive scale of possible pain and struggle and the way the person expresses that depression. Schizophrenia too can be a scale. And part of the challenge is how it's managed as well. Schizophrenia is actually a really neat example. Schizophrenia is one of the greatest success stories in mental health. Because for most of human history, schizophrenia was absolutely 100% incurable. You were just insane and you were doomed to live a terrible life if you weren't killed for being a crazy person. Antipsychotics are just barely under 100% effective for essentially eliminating all symptoms of schizophrenia. Wow. It's a genuine, joyous miracle. Now, unfortunately, there are some side effects that are not fun. And so I still feel really bad for people who struggle with schizophrenia. But the meds, as long as you stay on them, the schizophrenia does not exist, not even a little bit. It's gone. That is a wonderful success story. So if someone's schizophrenic, but they're taking their meds, well, then they're just as functional as I am. So surely we should give them the same freedoms. But then what if they decide, you know what, I'm good, and they stop taking their meds, which does happen.
Yeah.
Well, we've already given the freedom to do everything that someone who's not schizophrenic can do, and so it didn't work. Our plan didn't work. In theory, it is genuinely sound. In practice, it strikes me as so complex a problem that I don't think it would ever actually work. I think I think it would cause so much more pain than it would alleviate.
I agree. And like what you're saying, there's so much nuances when it comes to that. Like at which stage of their progression in the condition that they at, if they're on or off their meds, or if they develop comorbidities as well, and how that could be adding to the implications and stuff. But it's a lot to really think about. But it's been a pleasure to have you, Michael, and I'm really glad that you've decided to come on and do this interview with me. I wish you all the best in your future as well, and I'll be sure to link you this entire clip once it's been processed and edited.
That'll be great. I can't wait to watch it. Yeah, some wonderful questions, Nicholas. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I'll be seeing you this Saturday for sure. Take care.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nicholas.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.